feedback or not?
Yeah, you just.
Okay, great. Okay.
So if you want to go to your share options.
This share screen option?
Yeah, share screen to your PowerPoint. Oh, now I can hear. Okay, okay. Great, okay.
Oh, wait.
So, yeah. And then I start the introduction.
I need to make sure I have my presenter mode because I want to have my notes. Okay, yeah.
Side so I can demask. All right, great. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining us in person here in Cleveland or remotely via Zoom, which we've all become very familiar with. We're excited to kick off the launch of the CUDC's lecture series this spring with our first guest, Maci Nelson. First, I'm going to introduce that our lecture series this spring is exploring the idea of hybridity in different forms, including hybrid ways of working, hybridized approaches to design, and social hybrids in urban environments. Our 5 speakers that we'll have this semester will explore access in the built environment, post-disciplinary practice, new models of historic preservation, opportunity for social inclusion, etc. The lectures will have a hybrid format. Today we are in person and virtual, and other lectures will be purely remote. All programs are free and open to the public. So we're excited to get started with Maci Nelson, who's going to talk to us today about multimodal design conversations. Pull up your bio. Maci is a graduate of our Masters of Landscape Architecture program here at Kent State University and is currently instructing one of our advanced studios here at the Cleveland Studios for Kent State in landscape architecture. She launched the podcast, the Landscape Nerd podcast in 2020 while she was still a student here in school. The podcast began as a way to share landscape stories that she found interesting and connect with others outside of the profession. She has over 24 episodes, and the podcast has reached thousands of listeners. And Maci has collaborated through this avenue with leaders in landscape architecture, ecology, and the arts. Today, she'll talk about her journey and how she engages her audience and guests into interdisciplinary discussions about landscape architecture. So thank you to the College of Architecture and Environmental Design for hosting and backing this series. And with that, I would like to introduce Maci. Come on up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It means a lot for me to come here and speak to you now that I have graduated and teaching and sharing what I've learned here with you all as an audience, but also the audience that I have around the world. So my name is Maci Nelson. I am a landscape designer and instructor and a podcaster, which is really what I'll focus on today. So, as Kat had mentioned, I do have a podcast, and I also am working in a practice here in Cleveland, Beirut Landscape Architecture as a designer, and then I graduated from this program. But this isn't really where the journey about where the podcast begins. It goes further back to my undergrad, because I kind of embraced this idea of hybridity and interdisciplinary for my entire educational career. And I didn't really have a background in design and didn't understand what it meant, how it related to my interests. So I actually went to Columbia College Chicago for traditional animation. I was looking into creating comic books and characters, and I learned how to study people and the world that way because my interest was in landscape and plants. And then I attended Hiram College, where I was actually focusing on ecology and learning systems that way. And so it just put those two together of having a storytelling platform or trying to figure out like a way to tell stories of landscape, incorporating like arts and science background. So that's part of the reason why we're here today to talk about multimodal design conversations. And when I say multimodal design conversations, may seem familiar in the terms of how we are interacting in this COVID world. We have audio visual technology that we use to convey information, but we also are more tactile. We are more comfortable in our homes. The way we receive information varies. And so I define it as a human-centric communications that use a variety of modes to convey design intent, experience, and questions. So it's saying that if you want to have a conversation about design, you're not limited to the verbal or the in-person. And that is where the podcast began. So in the beginning, when I was starting, it was January 2020, like before the right as the pandemic was getting started. And I wanted to share stories that I found interesting, things that weren't related to academia or what we were studying in school. I was just hoping to talk about, you know, the local nature park that we have, or when we went on a visit out of town, like there's this really interesting park made out of like metal and hard materials. It was a park, but it wasn't made with plants and greenery, or something that's strange, you know, like a tree that was cut down in a weird way, but people would use it for like seating just obscurely. So I wanted to have a place where we could talk about those things in addition to the academic world and higher education. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sure. Like closing down the presentation and then relaunch the presentation, or close the PowerPoint? Oh, okay. Does that work? Can anyone see? Okay. All right. So, like I said, it started in 2020, and the beginning of the podcast was very informal, not really a clear message. It was just sharing stories in a way that I like to tell them, which was taking an everyday landscape or space and talking about it poetically and hoping that people could see the magic in it. But then the lockdown happened and a lot more attention on landscape started to happen, and a lot more conversations about what landscape needs to look like moving forward. And so that was very interesting for me as a new content creator. I started to see different ways that people who may or may not have consulted landscape designers or architects or city plan, I didn't know how people came up with these ideas, but I thought it was interesting that it was happening and it was being shown through social media, through the news. Like landscape was at the forefront, and that was exciting. And then on top of that, the public spaces that we have designed were now used as places of demonstration. And this was happening all over the world, but here in Cleveland, we had our march, the Black Lives Matter protest and demonstration. And that led to ownership of space and demonstration of our own Black Lives Matter mural on the street. Additionally, across the globe in Thailand, students were doing protests for democracy and reform. So we started to have this understanding of what space can be used for, even though that's not what it was intended for, and then also capacity and how many people could be in a space and how our bodies in space start to have a different context depending on the programming or purpose that's come about in these recent years. So I had an opportunity to keep up with that momentum on my small podcast and respond in the same way that a lot of other people were responding and setting out messages about supporting Black Lives Matter. So I made an episode saying that we need diversity in landscape. And it was following along the same lines of the same timeline as a lot of other brands, right? You had the former Council of Literary Magazine and Presses, Vogue, Lego, Poetry Foundation, National Geographic, places were saying what they, you know, that they were in support. And I had this opportunity where I didn't have to hold back my thoughts because I wasn't in an institution anymore. I wasn't a part, I graduated from school and I was starting a practice, but not really sure where I was going to work because it was pandemic and I had all of those struggles. But I talked about, my own frustrations with not knowing a lot of designers of color, not feeling like they were highlighted, not seeing different types of landscapes, demonstrated from all across the world that maybe I sought out myself or could have been taught in class. Or I also talked about biases that I thought existed, and I admitted that whether I knew they were or not, I didn't know. I was putting something out there to have a response to what was going on in the world, and then I also then received a response from a growing audience. And then the episode I made directly after that was the African Americans Gardens episode. And when I was producing this one, it was my opportunity to showcase one of the typologies I wish was taught when I was in school. I wanted to understand more about how this typology could have impacted design, or how it would have impacted designers if they knew about it. And this is one of the most popular episodes I have to this day. It continuously comes up and people are messaging me and letting me know that they learned so much. And this is when I started to make a shift from just telling stories and sharing my thoughts to turning this into an educational resource for the public, a wide public, not just people who were in landscape architecture. So I started to include multimodal components, being photography, and making sure that was that was included. I would write out a script to make this more narrative driven so that people would follow along and it was more intriguing and engaging. I would include resources. I would allow for people to give me feedback and be constructive, and also people would leave me messages on the platform that I use. People could respond to the episode as soon as they heard it, and they could record their thoughts and they send it to me. And then also social media became a huge part of how I continued conversations from something that was a standalone content piece, like an episode. And through social media, people could constantly respond, whether it was a year ago or last week. It didn't matter, that I could have interaction with them. And that's very different than when you're typically learning about something. It's in the moment, right? Or it's on a book or a printed piece. It's not necessarily a live person behind it who can respond to you. So the process initially started off very, it felt very one-sided. Like I was speaking to people, not sure who was going to pick this up. And I was not sure if anyone understood what I was trying to say. So that is why I started to give myself some guidelines that if I am going to speak, I'm going to speak from, even though I'm a novice about all of these topics that I'm bringing up in the podcast, I'm using resources to inform my thoughts. I'm doing a little bit of preliminary research to understand what other discussions are being had currently. I'm not trying to go in there completely cold, but I'm also a novice. My idea is that I'm introducing people to an idea, and then I share those resources. Also, the resources are not anything, they don't come from any place that has a paywall. So if it's only free and public resources that I use. And I do that specifically because if I want the public to understand what I'm trying to say, I need to know that they can see the same thing that I have seen. So everything I post it has come from a free resource. And then it allows people to have conversations independently on their own before they get back to me or within their own offices, which has been great to hear, and also even in their classroom. So I'm getting the information to them and they get the information right back to me, and it becomes very cyclical and a really engaged platform. And so the outcome ends up me having a lot of different topics that have either been prompted by myself or by others who have asked to know more about something. And students especially have reached out to me from all different disciplines to say that they were interested in different topics and wanted to know if I could talk about them. And one of them, and I'll go through a series of like highlighted projects. The Bravely Curious podcast was a collaboration with Cal Poly Pomona. They had a landscape studio in their undergraduate class that created an entire series of episodes that talked about social justice and immigration. And so I did their introductory episode, which was a huge undertaking. I was just saying, talk about social injustice and landscape. And that was very difficult to do, but it was great to know that I was just the start of something. And then they took it on for 6 more episodes. And they also scripted everything. I gave them a little workshop on how to make a podcast. They scripted in English and in Spanish, and both episodes are produced in both. Then I was asked to do a biography piece on the host of the Landscape Architecture podcast, where he asked me to tell the world his story and left it at that. He was like, just take responsibility. And I thought, I'm not a journalist, but I guess I'm starting to turn into something like that for the design world and the landscape world. And what was great about this project is I was able to speak to some leaders, Gina Ford from Agency, and Jonathan Giels, Jason Kenter, Wendy Miller. These are all people who are prominent in the landscape architecture world that I would never have thought to approach. I would have just watched their work from a distance. And here I am able to have intimate conversations with them about people and understand some of their motivations. And then also surround it with topics that relate to Michael, who's the subject, but also to anyone who's interested in landscape. Then I was able to work with leaders in different disciplines, which was great. So this little series that I started to create in the podcast was called Interdisciplinary, which is where that was my favorite part of all my episodes, was being able to work within other disciplines and connect them to landscape. So in this one, I spoke to a poet from the region, and she was describing her work with landscape inspiring her poetry, and also then moving into how landscape connects visually with the stars and the sky. And so that was really interesting to see that someone who has no idea really how landscape architecture works could relate and resonate with the works of landscape. And then what was great about that as well is that people reached out to me so much for this episode, because a lot of designers are artistic and poetic people, and they don't necessarily have that voice or the space to showcase that. Then I did one with an aquatic ecologist out of Clemson University, and we spoke on how he views landscape and how we view landscape, both having a systems approach to creating solutions. And he has a specialty in social sciences, where bringing in people, just community science, I should say, and speaking to them about what science is. So we had that commonality. We're trying to give the basics and get people engaged. And then also I was able to work with an artist who had a landscape architecture background, but she focused on collage art. And she helped me with an episode that talked about collage as a way of representation and what that means in terms of materiality and intent and different forms of communicating your ideas through collage. And then this one is just like probably more fun things are that on this podcast, it's my own, so I get to have fun with it in ways that I maybe wouldn't have been able to do in school. So I'm a huge Studio Ghibli fan, and Howl's Moving Castle is one of my favorite movies, and I was able to talk about landscape intersecting with that media and that mode of communication, because the landscape is rendered very beautifully, but it's based off of real places, but there's a whole concept and strategy to how that's communicated. I also get to discuss maximalism in landscape, which also we don't get to touch on, because if you're working in public places, sometimes that's not the goal. Maximalism and intricate designs aren't always well received or needed, and they aren't the solution, but in other places it can be, such as the world of hospitality. So being able to explore that for an episode was great. And then also Thai gardens, you can't really see it here, but I was able to do an episode that focused on some of my personal background, as well as Thai gardens, which is another typology that people may not have even been able to know about or be exposed to or understand the organization. So that's how I know that this is working. But for me, the conversations that I get to have look a lot like this. I ask a question on Instagram and people respond. Or like but I get to ask something that's very basic. I don't necessarily need to ask them hard-hitting questions to get responses from an audience, because my goal is to introduce people to the world of landscape architecture and treat it as the common denominator that the outside world really is for all of us. So I get to say something like, how are you a landscape nerd? And someone says they use the word urban fabric way too much. And I think that's great. And there's no such thing as too much. Or I can put a poll out. And I did an episode on the Horseshoe Lake Dam that's in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and they're decommissioning the dam. And so there's a lot of dispute and debate about it. And I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on that and into journalism. And I put a poll on saying, like, what do they think about keeping the dam or getting rid of it? And so on Instagram, they said get rid of the dam. But then on Facebook, most people wanted to keep the dam. So those are different things and prompt different types of conversations that I wouldn't have been able to have if I had just done one in-person presentation. Then I also can ask very specific questions about the profession. So for those of you who don't know, the landscape architecture registration exam is given in 4 parts. I recently took the first exam or first section and I passed. But then I look back at some of the passing rates just overall, and they were relatively low, but then a few years back, they're a little bit higher. So I just was curious what people who were planning on taking this exam thought about that. And I got this question, which was, what is the layer? And I thought that was great because I never really thought about explaining that, and having an international audience gave me an opportunity to address that for anyone else. Then someone is able to say that they thought the language was confusing, or that they didn't understand what they needed in order to study and prepare. And then I had this interaction, which was someone who's able to really feel comfortable telling me what they thought, because it's me. It's not Clark who's really putting on the layer. It's not their school. It's not the professor. It's someone who's removed from that, and it's a safe space for them to share with their thoughts. And also it looks like this for me, where people leave me voice messages, like I said, and maybe that's the most convenient thing. They're able to say, hey, can I talk about this? Or what do you think about that? And I can, like a walkie-talkie, respond to them immediately. And so these 2 episodes are ones where I got a lot of voicemails for. And specifically that last one, someone asked me to like send my notes to them, and they created part of their class off of that. So like we're already starting to share information and education throughout the world. And having this global reach is something I never thought was going to happen, but I'm currently being listened to in over 60 countries, and that I just still can't believe that. And I know that this is a trend, and I'm hoping it picks up, and I'm just a part of a bigger movement to get different landscape conversations moving, because different Instagram and social media pages such as Laura Booknook that recommends different landscape books, or Landscape of Means takes the comedic side of things. I make all the jokes about designing landscapes and they put it online. Or there's this nonprofit called Landscape Skills, and they try to give as many free resources to designers as possible. Or this Wandering Landscape Architect, there's someone who's a landscape architect and they travel around the world, take pictures, and they promote other sites like theirs. And then additionally, within podcasts, there's a growing group in the network, and we started to communicate quarterly, and maybe we'll turn ourselves into like a landscape architecture network so that people can go to one destination to receive different viewpoints. So Landscape Architecture Podcast talks to other professions practicing, like professionals who are practicing. John to Scale and Greenside take a more casual, like, views of someone who's a practitioner, not necessarily like someone who's a leader or a speaker. And then the green side is like students and students of landscape architecture and their perspectives. Then Renisha, she focuses on amplifying marginalized voices in all over the world, and she's based out of Canada. And then you have my podcast that talks about landscape spaces and topics, and then tries to do it in a storytelling format to connect with others, just to give a baseline awareness to what landscape is. So moving forward, what else will I be working on, or the podcast works on, in order to increase the hybridity and interdisciplinary projects. I'm working with on an episode with a woman who founded the nonprofit Disabled Hikers, and is talking about bringing access to naturalized spaces. Then also working with the American Society of Botanical Artists and how we represent plants, and how landscape architects and designers represent their knowledge of plants, you know, either in a rendering, or how do you amplify that, right? And go beyond basic labeling. And then also Cozad Bates House, which is now recognized landmark on the Underground Railroad, was, I don't know when it was conducted, it was revealed or unveiled this past fall, and Dairy Landscape Architecture actually worked on the landscape of that project. And so it was so cool. And if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, if you're in Cleveland, it's in University Circle, it's turned into a museum type, and so there's things to do on the inside. I'm not sure if they're open right now because of COVID, but keep an eye out. And then this is actually the next episode that I'm working on, which is landscape music, and it's about composers of classical music who have been inspired by landscape and won the landscapemusic.org, their nonprofit, and that's like inspired by landscape. And then American Wild Ensemble, they perform in landscape. So it's looking at both sides of that. So that is, you know, there's so many ways to communicate ideas, and I'm hoping that I'm just the start of something bigger. And thank you so much. If you want to learn more, you can go visit the website at thelandscapenerd.com. Yeah. Yeah, get snacks and things like that.
Joining us remotely, we can put them into the chat and we'll see them.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Also, a lot of my conversations are that too when it comes to people from around the world. They say, okay, I enjoy what you're doing. Oh, sure. Sure. Do you want me to repeat the question? Okay. So for those at home or offices, I was asked, how did I grow my podcast audience? And the answer is organically. I didn't seek to find sponsorship. Some people had sought things out and like talked to me, but because my goal was to keep this educational, I wasn't, one, I'm a mom and I was a student starting off. I wasn't sure how quickly or how consistently I'd be able to create content. So I didn't want to force anything. And that has probably given me the most engaging audience I could probably ask for, because I wasn't going out, following other accounts or emailing people. You know, I was just letting people spread the word and talk about it and tell my friends and family and coworkers, because I'm working in the profession, that there's usually always an opportunity for me to talk to someone new who hasn't heard about the podcast and introduce it that way. So. That was a series, yeah, not just me. I mean, I wish. Oh, yes. Oh, sure. So the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking, just so I'm summing it up for audience at home, that you're wondering if there's a narrative or a narrative-led design intervention that could happen in urbanized spaces that might respond to how Cleveland was, you know, before it was industrialized.
Sorry, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to recover from
Yeah.
no, I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. So in general, when it comes to looking at history in landscape and then trying to discuss it, I do exactly that. I do the research, I find or something that prompts my own thoughts to say what is important or what are people taking away from the space today, and then finding out if there is a connection. Because sometimes that's the unfortunate truth, is that meaning gets erased over time. And so whether or not I bring that back up in a conversation or resurface those findings, it depends, you know. I tend to, even though it can be sad, I did an episode also on a memorial of a school fire, and it's like I don't like to dwell on that, but I also don't think it needs to be erased or ignored just for comfort's sake. So there's definitely space for it. I think this is one of the only ways that it might be able to be done by anyone, right? That anyone can contribute their thoughts. It's not necessarily a, you know, some institution backing that. So that I think there is a lot of space for that. And in Cleveland, there's so much, and I am going to be exploring that. Yeah. So the question was, how does my podcasting influence my design work? So I have noticed a difference, and good and bad. On one hand, I have a strong desire to make things very detail oriented or very poetic, even though that's not what is necessary or have time for, right? There are real life constraints that happen. And so I end up channeling a lot of that into the podcast and my investigations that way. And it allows for me to be a better in practice designer because I understand the different ideas I've gone through in my head, and I can go through them fairly quickly because I'm always getting new ideas. And then I'm able to discuss them with my teammates pretty efficiently or succinctly, and we're able to come up with design solutions that fit. So it is good because we can get through a lot more creative solution, like possible solutions, but it's bad because I feel a little less satisfied, or I'm just always lingering with the what could have been. Mhm. Oh, I have two. I have two people that I would love to interview. One being Monty Don. I don't know if everyone's familiar with him, but he is a like garden and historical landscape site TV show host, and he does documentaries. And he's probably one of the people I would that has a framework as people who have experience talking to the public about landscape. And then also Bill Bensley. He is a maximalist designer out of Bangkok, Thailand, and he does exclusively hospitality design, and he is a like all-encompassed studio. So if you go with him, he's designing your building, your uniforms, your art, your everything like that. And I think that takes so much work as a team that I'd be fascinated to see how you balance all of that. It's not just one aspect. So. I did talk about his work, but I didn't get to talk to him. But I also didn't reach out. I wasn't there yet. Yeah, so if I could project, I would, I'm gonna go bigger. I'm gonna go like 10 years from now, right? Because I think it would be great to make landscape architecture a household profession, like known profession, the same way architecture is. That is really what I want to do. So I plan on covering as many topics as I can that find intersections with other disciplines. So, you know, when you really think about it, it's almost endless, because if you ever have to step foot outside, there's something that you can connect to. And I imagine like another 25 episodes, you know, in a year, try to like amp up my production and talking to more people. So it's not going to be organized or linear probably, but my bigger goal is that it's to make this a known profession for everybody. Oh, sure. So the method that I use to create a podcast is very similar to any writing method. So you create a first draft that you probably throw away immediately or mark up. Some of your favorite parts end up getting left behind. But I think of a topic, I brainstorm and write out what I know about the topic. And then I immediately research those points that I know, and then those references tend to lead me to experts, you know, who understand the topic or the field intimately. And I either reach out to them to see if they are able to do an interview, or I read their works, and then I synthesize that into a script, and then I record on, I started off with everything free. So like I had my, like a small microphone that actually that one I did purchase from Amazon. And then I had Audacity, which was what I used, and Anchor is still the platform that I use for streaming my podcast. And that was also free. So it was just bare bones, very grassroots start. And each episode, depending on the topic, takes about 6 to 8 hours of like writing and research. And then who knows with recording whether or not my voice is shaky that day or it's windy or something like that. Oh, but to kind of go back to your question, is then I'm adding into the future video and more on-site recording, and learning that technology will be new for me. And I've reached out to some other people who are more experienced in that to show me like, how do I walk through a landscape myself and talk about the experience I'm having and tell the story in place. They would be on my website at thelandscapenerd.com when they get there. Yeah, when we get started. New year, that's what we'll work on. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
We have Maci here. Let's give her a round.
So thank you those who joined us remotely and in person for our first lecture of the spring series. Ask for a moment so maybe people can hear me better. Our next lecture will be February 11th at noon, and we're having preservation side B for your question will be N, and I believe it will be remote only. Is that right? Are they coming in person? Oh, we do. It will be split. You can come again in person, or you can join us from home on your computer. So we're excited to have them again on February 11th at noon. So we will look for you all then. Thank you so much for joining us.